So welcome to the week 8 topics of the forensic photography, wherein we're going to talk about the three pillars of photography: the camera exposures, exposure with flash, and the different photographic filters. So let's start. So let's watch this video about the three pillars of photography. Ano nga ba yung tinutukoy nating three pillars of photography?
The camera, an instrument that captures emotions like never before, be it happy, sad, or shocked. It clicks whatever is in front of it, no matter how big, how small, how fast, or how slow. Slow, slow, slow. There it is. But for this, you need to know how to get the perfect picture. Ta-da! You gotta change that. Ta-da! For this, you need to know three basic terms: the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO. Any professional DSLR gives you the liberty to change the values for all the three. But before changing the values, you should know what they mean. Let's start with the aperture. It looks something like this, and it controls the amount of light entering the camera and is expressed in f numbers. Lower the f number, larger the aperture and more bright the image will be. Higher the f number, smaller the aperture and more dark the image will be. The aperture is directly related to the depth of field. Lower the f number, larger the aperture and more blur the background and foreground will be. Higher the f number, smaller the aperture and more clear the background and foreground will be. Now let's talk about shutter speed. It stands for the length of time a camera shutter is open to expose light into the camera sensor. Fast shutter speed, say 1/1000th of a second, will freeze any action. Medium shutter speed, say 1/50th of a second, will just start to give blurred images. And as you keep pushing the shutter speed value up, you will reach the slower shutter speeds. That is anything above 1 second, and you'll get completely blurred images. Shutter speed also affects the exposure. High shutter speed, lower the exposure. Low shutter speed, higher the exposure. Next is the ISO, which is the level of sensitivity of your camera to available light. Low ISO means a clean image. High ISO means a noisy image. So, now that you know the three pillars of photography, just get your focus right and click.
Okay, based from the video, what are the three pillars of photography? Based from that video,
Aperture.
can you give me the three? Yes? Anyone? Yes, Hernandez.
Ano ma'am? Aperture, shutter, tsaka ISO.
Okay. We have the ASI. Basic nga, sabi nga natin. The three pillars of photography, we have the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO. So, in order for us to capture the picture that we want with with bokeh effect, with full sharp, we need to understand the basic, sabi nga niya, yung ASI, the aperture, shutter speed, and the ISO. Kasi ito yung nagko-control doon sa image na gusto nating makuha. So, that is what we call the exposure triangle. Ayan, the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO. The exposure triangle is an analogy to explain the main elements that affect exposure in photography. All the three sides of triangle must be always in balance to take the right exposure. But sometimes because we are using or we just want to have photography as an art, hindi nagbabalance yung aperture, shutter speed, and ISO natin. But if we always consider to take katulad ng sa ating crime scene photography or crime scene documentation, we need to make sure that those three pillars or the exposure triangle are always in balance. Kasi ang kailangan natin sa crime scene photography is the clear image, is the exact image of what our eyes can see. So the exposure triangle is an analogy again of the three pillars of the photography: the aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. So according to the exposure triangle definition, all three elements must be in balance in order to get a perfectly exposed photo. So this often results in having exposure value or EV equal to 0 when selecting the right metering mode. If after achieving such a balance, you need to change any of the settings that affect the exposure, you will have to compensate adjusting the other two settings to continue maintaining the exposure value or the balance of the exposure triangle. Kailangan kasi yung EV sa mga ida-download yung apps niyan, yung ating Procam, may makikita kayo doon EV. Kailangan yon yung EV natin is naka-zero. Kapag ibig sabihin ng naka-zero siya, ibig sabihin equal ang lahat doon. Minsan kahit hindi nyo na i-download yung apps, kung maganda yung phone nyo, tapos naka-built-in yung magandang camera settings na meron siyang Procam agad, you can use that phone or you can use that camera app already. But to those students who doesn't have that kind of camera in their phone, I suggest to download the Procam X para may magamit kayo sa ating activities, dun sa ating laboratory activities number 12. So, isa-isahin natin yan. Isa-isahin natin yung tatlong pillars. We have the aperture, we have the shutter speed, and the ISO. But for today, okay, or for now, we're going to tackle what is aperture. I know that we discussed this already last week about the aperture, but for the further, okay, discussion because of this exposure triangle, because of this three pillars of photography, we need to rediscuss to give you some additional points about the aperture. So let's watch this first.
What is aperture? Perhaps the most influential parameter of photography, aperture plays an important role in composition and setting up a shot. Let's take a closer look. Simply put, aperture is the hole in the lens through which light travels into the camera body and onto the camera sensor. To understand, let's look at the human eye. All cameras are designed like human eyes. The cornea of our eye is similar to the front element of the lens, gathering light and bending it inward toward the iris. The iris can expand or shrink, controlling the size of the pupil, which passes light into the inner eye. The pupil is what we refer to as the aperture in photography. The amount of light that falls onto the retina is determined by the size of the pupil. The larger the pupil, the more light falls onto the retina. The larger the aperture of the lens, the more light enters the camera. The iris of the lens controls the size of the aperture and is called the diaphragm. The diaphragm's function is to block all light with the exception of the light that goes through the aperture. In photography, aperture is expressed in f numbers, also known as f-stops. F-stops are a way of describing how open or closed the aperture is. The smaller the f-stop means a larger aperture, while a larger f-stop means a smaller aperture. This can be tricky to remember since large f-stops mean small aperture sizes. So an f-stop of f1.4 is larger than f2.8 and much larger than f8 or f11. Aside from controlling the amount of light passing through the lens and into the camera, the aperture has a direct impact on the depth of field, the area of the image that appears sharp. A large f number such as f16 will bring all foreground and background objects into focus, while a small f number such as f1.4 will isolate either the foreground or background objects and make everything else blurry. Every lens has a limit on how large or small the aperture can get. If you take a look at the specifications of your lens, it should indicate the maximum apertures, lowest f numbers, and minimum apertures, highest f numbers. The maximum aperture of the lens is much more important than the minimum aperture. because it shows the speed of the lens. Lenses with apertures of f1.4 or f2.8 are considered fast lenses because they can pass more light into the camera than, for example, a lens with a maximum aperture of f4 or f5.6. That's the reason night photography usually requires fast lenses. The minimum aperture of a lens is usually not important and should rarely be used, as diffraction will cause the image to lose clarity. It is also worth noting the two types of lenses, primes and zooms. Prime lenses have a fixed focal length, meaning they cannot zoom without physically moving closer or further away from the subject. Zoom lenses give you the flexibility for you to zoom in or out of an object while remaining stationary. While prime lenses will have a fixed maximum aperture, the maximum aperture of a zoom lens will often get smaller as the focal length increases. These lenses are called variable aperture lenses. This is important because for a zoom lens with a focal length of 70 to 200 millimeters, the aperture may increase from f3.5 to f5.6, decreasing the amount of light entering the camera. Because aperture controls the amount of light entering the camera, it also affects other parameters such as ISO and shutter speed. A larger aperture or smaller f number will let more light into the camera, allowing you to use a faster shutter speed or lower ISO value. This is beneficial to eliminate motion blur and reduce the amount of noise that your camera will produce if its ISO gets bumped up. Faster shutter speeds can be essential in scenes with lots of motion, like sports and wildlife photography. So a fast lens can help increase your shutter speed or decrease your ISO value if your shutter speed is set to a specific value. Fast lenses are also imperative for any kind of nighttime photography. Whether you're taking pictures of the Milky Way or doing a moonlit photo shoot, large apertures will let as much light in as possible. Small apertures can be useful as well. Shooting landscape scenes requires everything in crisp focus, so smaller apertures will sharpen any out-of-focus areas that may come about. To enable manual adjustment of aperture values, set your camera to either aperture priority or manual mode. Aperture priority will let you change aperture values manually, while leaving shutter speed and ISO up to the camera's internal metering system. Manual mode lets you control every aspect of the camera, allowing you to change ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. I personally leave my camera in aperture priority mode 99% of the time for most types of photography. With all this information, you should be able to start using your lenses and cameras to the best of their ability. Aperture is probably the most stylistic setting you can change on your camera, allowing for unique effects that can take your images to the next level.
Okay, that is the scenario or the tricky part about the aperture. So, most of the time, the photographers use the aperture priority in taking pictures, lalo na kapag they wanted a clear a clear photo or image. Kasi, ang mangyayari nun, automatically, i-adjust lang nila yung aperture and then the shutter speed and ISO will automatically move for the system. Yung mga gumagamit ng DSLR. So, aperture is one of the photography basics along with the ISO and shutter speed. So, one of the three components of our exposure triangle. But aperture doesn't just affect the exposure. It also plays a key role in photography aspects such as the depth of field and sharpness, which is na-discuss natin nga last week. Aperture photography is the opening of the camera lens, which is related to the amount of light that passes through the camera lens to the image sensor. The aperture mechanism in the lens that allows more or less light to come in a form of a series of opaque blades are what we call the diaphragm. So, yung blades na nakikita nyo na black, na nag-a-adjust kapag iniikot natin yung aperture ring, ang tawag po natin doon ay diaphragm. Okay? Diaphragm. So, when the blades are open, your camera sensor will capture more light, whereas the blades progressively close, less light will hit your sensor. So, what is a large and a small aperture? I will ask you, this is just a review. If I wanted to have a large aperture, ano ang gagawin ko? Ano dapat ang f-stop number ko? Ha? Hello?
F16 po.
If I wanted to have a larger aperture, anak, kailangan ba ang aking, ano ang gagawin ko sa mga f-stop number ko? Anong isiset kong number sa kanya? Lower or higher?
Lower.
Lower pala pang baliktad na.
Lower. Di ba yung aperture mismo, okay, tandaan nyo, yung aperture mismo, yun yung mismong butas. Di ba? Kapag gusto natin ng mas malaki or large aperture, therefore, ano sabi niya dito? You should put your f-stop number or use the f-stop number which is in lower number. Di ba nga baliktad yung senaryo natin dito? So, anong mangyayari kapag meron kang large aperture? You have the wide opening. Mas malaki yung aperture mo. Mababa ang f-stop number mo. Ayan. Ano ang mangyayari? What will happen kapag mas malaki ang butas ng aperture? It will allow the light to, or it will allow the more light to come in the camera lenses. When you use the largest aperture in your lens, you're using a wide open aperture. So, ibig sabihin, mas madami ang papasok na light. So, a small aperture naman, in the opposite, kabaligtaran lang. So, for example, okay, you wanted to have a smaller aperture. Anong gagawin mo sa f-stop number mo niyan? Kailangan?
Malaki, ma'am.
Malaki yung f-stop number mo para mas maliit yung makukuha mong aperture size. What will happen kapag sa mga lights niya? Ibig sabihin, it won't allow many or more lights to come in the camera. Sabi nga nila, when you use the smallest aperture in your lens, you're using the stop-down aperture. Okay? Large aperture, this is what we call the low ranging. And kapag naman sa small aperture, we are using the high aperture. Diba? Okay. Let's continue. Kailan ba natin pwedeng gamitin si large and small? Diba? How aperture and exposure are related? Or paano ba nakaka-effect yan sa atin sa triangle, diba? Dun sa ating exposure triangle. As we anticipated in the introduction, aperture affects exposures and plays a fundamental role in determining along the ISO shutter speed and the optimal exposure in an image. With the fixed ISO, with the fixed ISO and shutter speed, the wider the aperture or the lower f values, the brighter your image will be. Nakita nyo? Kapag meron ka ng fixed ISO, ito na yung gagawin nilang aperture priority. Ilalagay mo sa aperture priority yung mismong settings ng camera mo. Okay? With the fixed ISO and shorter speed, the wider the aperture or lower f values, the brighter your image will be. And the narrower your aperture or the higher f values, the darker it will be. Okay? Bakit po? Bakit, ma'am? Kasi 'di ba kapag mas wider ang aperture mo, tapos naka-fix na yung ISO mo at saka shutter speed, therefore, ang mangyayari nun, mas marami ang papasok na light. So, mas magiging bright yung image mo. Pero, kapag naka-fix na yung ISO mo, naka-fix na rin ang shutter speed mo, tapos you have a narrower aperture or smaller opening of your aperture, therefore, the more na nagiging darker. Kapag mas maliit ang butas, mas lalong dumidilim ang iyong image. So, large apertures are also known as the fast apertures since they allow you to decrease the exposure time. And small apertures are also known as low apertures naman since they allow you to increase the shutter speed. Diba? Bakit? For example, I will just, for example, dito na lang. For example, umaga ngayon. Tirik na tirik ang araw. Okay? Maliwanag, 'di ba? Maliwanag. Anong gagawin mo sa aperture mo?
Maliit butas.
Kailangan maliit lang ang butas. Bakit po? Kasi maliwanag naman na, 'di ba? What if kapag madilim naman?
Malaki, ma'am.
Kailangan mas malaki ang
Butas. Ang aperture.
aperture mo. Kasi para pumasok yung light. Naintindihan niyo po ba niyan? So, nagbabalance niyan. Bibigyan ko kayo, ipapasok ko na unti-unti yung shutter speed, ha? Paano kapag gabi ngayon, okay? Gabi ngayon, tapos gusto mong kuhanin yung moon. Okay? Ano naman yung senaryo natin sa shutter speed? Kapag madilim. Di ba diniscuss ko na to? Kapag madilim ang isang bagay, kailangan ang shutter speed mo ay
Matagal.
Malaki yung...
Okay. Tapos, kapag naman maliwanag, kailangan ang shutter speed mo ay
Mabilis.
mabilis. Okay. Ngayon, for example, madilim. You need to take a photo of the moon. Anong gagawin mo sa aperture mo? Paglalaroan mo yung tatlo. The ISO, the shutter speed. O, wag mo ng ISO. Sige, yung dalawa muna. The shutter speed and the aperture. Kukuhanin mo yung moon. You need to take a photo of the moon. Yan, gabi. Ano ang gagawin mo sa aperture mo? Iset mo yung F number mo or F stop values mo into
Lower.
lower number para magkaroon ka ng wider aperture. Bakit? Kasi po, ma'am, gabi. You need more light. What will happen? Ano naman ang gagawin mo sa inyong shutter speed? Mabilis naman ba o mabagal?
Mabagal.
Mabagal. Kasi kailangan mo ngang magpasok ng
Madaming ilaw.
So, doon pumapasok yung exposure triangle. Naiintindihan nyo po ba? Wherein, tingnan nyo, kapag nakafix na ang ISO at nakafix ang shutter speed, at ang ina-adjust mo lang is the aperture, doon kayo nagkakaroon ng problema. Tignan nyo ha, tignan nyo. The wider the aperture, the brighter your image will be. But, if the narrower your aperture, the darker it will be. So, anong gagawin mo? Kailangan mong mag-adjust. Okay, next slide tayo. So, how to set an aperture in camera? Sometimes, using the aperture ring kapag manual mode, ayan, pwede mo namang gamitin ito. Yung mismong, kanwari, wala pa kayong DSLR, ayan, pwede naman sa mismong aperture ring. Or, even kapag sa DSLR, pwede ring i-adjust ang iyong aperture ring dyan sa ating lens. Or sometimes, kadalasan kasi ngayon, ang ginagamit nila is itong aperture priority mode. Ayan. Nakikita niyo ba yung MASP? Ayan, di ba? M is manual mode. Manual mode yan. Iba yung auto mode sa A. Yung A stands for aperture priority. Same with this AV. Aperture priority mode yan. Okay, next. Okay na ba tayo kay aperture niyan? Do you have any questions? Mamaya, iikutin natin yung tatlo. Meron kayong tanong about the aperture? I just want to take emphasis lang dito ha. Wait nga lang. Asan yun? Sabi dito, the large apertures are also known as the fast apertures. Bakit po? Kasi, bakit siya fast? Kapag large kasi ang aperture mo, mas madami ang light na pumapasok. So, therefore, mabilis lang ang click mo. Kung kanwari, nasa maliwanag naman, for example, you have enough light. Kaya sinasabi niyang large aperture, fast apertures. For example, the normal scenario, we have enough light. Daylight, sabi nating daylight. So, kapag naka-large aperture ka naman na, kailangan ang shutter speed mo, mabilis lang. 'Di ba? Bakit? Kasi maliwanag naman na, tapos malaki pa ang butas ng iyong aperture. Ngayon naman, yun naman sinatawag nilang small apertures or yung maliliit na apertures or yung small opening, ang tinatawag nilang slow apertures. Kasi nga, dahil lumiliit siya, mas lalong dumidilim yung ating image, therefore, kailangan ng mas matagal na time ng ating shutter speed. Kaya niya sinabi na slow aperture siya. So, punta na tayo niyan kay shutter speed. So, what is shutter speed naman? Okay. Makinig kayong mabuti.
What is shutter speed? Well, it may seem like the answer is obvious. There's more to shutter speed than meets the eye. Let's take a closer look. Shutter speed is one of the three pillars of photography, the other two being ISO and aperture. Also known as exposure time, shutter speed is defined as the length of time the image sensor in a camera is exposed to incoming light. Before we go more in depth, however, let's take a look at the different parts of the camera that contribute to taking a photo. In a standard DSLR, when you press the shutter button, a mirror flips up, allowing light to pass into the camera instead of the viewfinder. Once the mirror is flipped upwards, a small door will move from top to bottom, exposing the sensor beneath. After that, another door will fall down, covering up the entire sensor. After the second door closes, your mirror will fall back into place. The doors will then reset to their original positions underneath. The longer the shutter is kept open, the more light will enter the camera. In auto mode, cameras will meter the scene and determine an adequate shutter speed to keep the picture from becoming either over or underexposed. You can manually change the shutter speed by either putting the camera in shutter priority mode, which will let you change shutter speed, letting the camera calculate ISO and aperture, or full manual mode, which gives you full control over all your camera settings. Shutter speeds are measured in fractions of a second when under 1 second. For example, 1/4 displayed on the camera means the shutter speed is 1/4 a second, whereas 1/250 means the shutter speed is 1/250th of a second. Most cameras can handle shutter speeds as fast as 1/4000th of a second, or sometimes even as high as 1/8000th of a second, and shutter speeds as long as 30 seconds. Longer shutter speeds can be achieved using a function known as bulb mode, where the shutter speed is determined by the length of time the shutter button is activated, either manually or through a remote trigger. It's good to know what effects different shutter speeds have, as it can affect the type of picture produced. Short shutter speeds, often quicker than 1/1000th of a second, are fast enough to capture the fast movement of wildlife and sports, and freeze water droplets and small particles. For everyday photography, shutter speeds around 1/100th of a second are fast enough to keep subjects from blurring. If you're shooting handheld, longer shutter speeds may also cause your shaky hands to blur the photo. Newer lenses from most manufacturers have attempted to solve this problem by introducing vibration reduction technology into lenses to correct for minor shakes. Night photography will often utilize longer shutter speeds to capture as much light as possible. Shutter speeds as long as 20 or 30 seconds may even be used to take pictures of the Milky Way. Knowing the principles of shutter speed will allow you to make better decisions about how you want your picture to look, whether you're freezing the action, creating a time warp effect, letting in little light, or as much as you can. Though it's a very basic concept of photography, it is no less important in making a fantastic photo. Stay subscribed to Apple Apps for more animations about photography released every
Tawag dito, we need to, what we call this, we need to go into the shutter speed priority. Kaya nga kanina, di ba, merong manual mode, aperture mode, merong shutter speed. Again, in film and digital cameras, ito yung nakikita nating parang curtain. na rectangular ba, yung rectangular na yon, which is kapag the more na lumiliit yon, the more na bumibilis ang ating shutter speed. Okay. Ano ang importance ng ating shutter speed in photography? Ito naman ang pinag-uusapan natin dito is the time. Okay? Since we called it as an exposure time. So, how to measure a shutter speed? Ayan. So, how do we measure the shutter speed? So, ito. Sabi ko nga sa inyo, the more na tumatagal or humahaba yung time ng ating shutter speed, it will become slower. At kapag nagiging part of a second na yan, nagiging siyang faster. So, shutter speed is measured in seconds and fractions of a second. So, the distance between one shutter speed time and another is called the exposure stop. Ito, exposure stop yan. So, shutter speed is measured in seconds and fractions. Ito yan. Kaya nga 1 over 15, 1 over 30, 1 over 500. So, kapag may nakita kang ganyan, anong pinakamalaki dyan? For example, yan, given, from 5 to over 1 part of the 500. Ha? Ano ang pinakamatagal dyan or yung slower shutter speed? 5 or ito? 1 over 500.
Yung
Yung
5 po.
5. Okay. Dali lang, di ba? So, how to measure shutter speed? In this way, considering that the other elements affecting the exposure, the aperture and ISO are set, the faster the shutter speed, the darker the image will be. Diba? Kung baga sa aperture, the smaller the aperture, the darker. Dito naman, the faster the shutter speed, the darker image will be. And the slower the shutter speed naman, or kung mabagal, for example, 5 seconds, the brighter the image it will be. So, sometimes there are limits to raise or lower the ISO and to change the aperture. So, in these cases, the shutter speeds will be essential for changing the exposure of the photo. Besides, setting a slow shutter speed will be essential in long exposure night photography. Kailan the best na pinapatagal ang ating shutter speed? Ha? Kailan the best ginagamit or kailan natin dapat pinapatagal ang ating shutter speed? Kapag kailan?
Kapag madilim ang gabi.
Kapag madilim or gabi, or sometimes kapag ang aperture mode natin or ang aperture ring natin or yung ating aperture opening is maliit. For example, maliit na nga yung butas ng aperture, therefore, kailangan ang shutter speed mo, kailangan mas mabagal. Bakit po? Bakit, ma'am? Kasi, yung ating aperture nun, kapag maliit na siya, therefore, konti na lang ang light na makukuha niya. Paano mo kukuhanin yon, di ba? Or, paano mo kaya lalaruin yon na maging mas bright pa ang image? Kailangan, babagalan mo din yung shutter speed mo. O, for example, hindi gabi, anak. For example, hindi gabi. O, daylight lang. Kaso, ang gamit mong aperture is smaller lang. Or yung nakaset siya sa bigger f-stop number, tapos you have the aperture opening which is very small. Sabihin na natin f32 yan, tapos napakaliit lang ng aperture mo. Kailangan ang ating shutter speed nun mas, mabagal or mabilis?
Mabagal.
Kailangan mas mabagal siya. In order for you to catch or to get more light to have a brighter image. Naiintindihan nyo po niyan. Ina-apply natin yung logic, no? Isipin nyo. Tayo kay slide 16. So, the second and most important effect of shutter speed on photography is what we call the motion. Ano yung motion? This is the movement. Diba? By using a slower or faster shutter speed, you'll be able to capture a more static or dynamic image, something that is also known as motion in photography. So, the blurry motion, ayan, the more na mas mabagal, okay? The more na slower po ang ating shutter speed, the more na nagiging blurred ang ating image. The more that the shutter speed is in the faster mode, the more na na-freeze natin ang motion. Diba? So, for example, you wanted to capture a moving butterfly. Diba? O, anong kailangan mong gawin? Kailangan ang shutter speed mo ay, alin?
Mabilis.
Mabilis. Kasi kapag mas mabilis ang shutter speed mo, mas nakukuhanan mo yung paggalaw ng iyong butterfly. Ibig sabihin, nag-freeze yan in motion. Pero kapag, for example, gumagalaw, ayan, kapag gumagalaw ang object mo tapos mabagal, 2 seconds ka palang magkiklik, ano ang mangyayari?
Blur.
Blurred. So, parang sa jump shot lang yan. Diba? Kung gusto mong makuha yung jump shot mo, kailangan ang shutter speed mo ay slower or faster?
Faster.
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 Okay. Nakikita nyo na yan? Napaglalaroan nyo na sa utak nyo yan? Na-mix nyo na ba niyan yung aperture at saka shutter?
Yes, ma'am. Pero
Okay.
medyo nalilito pa.
Medyo nalilito pa. Konti pa. Setting a shutter speed on a camera. Paano yun nakita yan? Dito lang, sa taas. So, to set a shutter speed on a camera, you can do it through any of the following ways. Sometimes in the manual, so shooting in a manual mode, you can manually set the shutter speed after the ISO and aperture according to the exposure you'd like to shoot. So, pwede mo naman kasing ano yan di ba? Tawag dito, sa kapag digital, you have the manual mode. So, after mo nang na-set itong aperture, ISO, pwede mo na rin iset itong shutter speed mo. For example, gusto mong gawing 5 seconds. For example, gusto mong gawing, gusto mong gawing mas mabilis doon, pwede din naman. In automatic, diba? Shooting in aperture mode, you can manually set the aperture and ISO and the camera will automatically adjust the best shutter speed. So, yung mga hindi marunong sa manual mode ng ating digital camera or ating DSLR, automatically lang ginagamit nila is automatic mode. So, para agad-agad, alam na nila or yung camera na ang mag-a-adjust. So, in film cameras naman, the shutter speed button used to be on the top right of the camera. Yung diniscuss natin noon, di ba nasa taas siya, yung iniikot niya. Yung merong 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, ganyan. Tapos, meron siyang B. Ano nga yung B? B stands for yung B doon sa ating shutter speed. Yung bilog sa bulb. Anong ibig sabihin ng bulb method na yon? Sinabi rin siya sa video, di ba?
Mas matagal pipindutin, ma'am.
Oo, mas matagal pipindutin. So, dalawa yon. It's either ikaw, manually, na pipindutin mong matagal, the more na hindi mo inaalis yung kamay mo doon sa shutter button, hindi magkuklose ang ating shutter sa loob ng camera. So, sometimes naman, through the use of remote control. Or remote trigger, sabi nga nila. Iiwan nila, iset nila na kapag nilagay nila yung remote trigger in 30 seconds, therefore, i-click niya yung shutter button natin, kung saan kayo nag-click, yung click na yon, kapag 30 seconds, dun iaangat ng remote trigger yung kanyang pagka-press sa ating shutter mode or shutter button para mag-release ang ating shutter sa loob ng camera. So, the bulb method, ito yung the long na pinipress mo yung shutter button, doon siya mag-i-stay. So, today, the shutter speed dial is usually on the top right, ayan, diba? Of the back of the camera, moving the wheel, you decrease or increase the shutter speed according to your camera setting. So, doon po natin ina-adjust ang ating shutter speed. Yan. How to do a slow shutter speed in photography. So, to do slow shutter speed photography, you must adjust the basic camera settings to take a correct exposure while using a long shutter speed. If it's during the day, makinig kayo ha, kasi ito yung magiging activity nyo. If it is during the day, set the base ISO or the native ISO where your camera produces the best quality and no noise. So, a narrow aperture, ibig sabihin, mas maliit, Consider the side effect of diffraction if you close down your aperture below f16, as explained in your article on aperture, decrease the shutter speed. So, anong mangyari? Magdi-decrease daw ang ating shutter speed. So, in daytime, slow shutter speed photography, you likely need the neutral density filters. So, para maiwasan po yung mga reflections of the light. Mamaya pag-uusapan din natin ng filters. To reduce the light hitting the sensor or you'll expose the overexpose the image. Kasi kapag umaga, sabi ko nga sa inyo, kapag mas mabagal or slower shutter speed ang ating meron sa ating camera, anong mangyayari? 'Di ba parang sunog? Ibig sabihin nun, ang tagal niyang naka-expose sa light, therefore, madaming pumasok na light. So, if it is night naman, anong gagawin mo? Increase the ISO according to the limits of your camera. Use a wide aperture to capture as much light as possible and set a slow shutter speed according to the external light and the scene that you want to achieve. In Milky Way photography, for example, you can do a long shutter speed photograph of 15 to 30 seconds. For example, yung moon, kinukuhanan mo gabi. Kasi kapag gabi, di ba, we don't have enough of light. So, what will happen? Kailangan ang shutter speed mo is mas matagal. So, therefore, kung madilim naman, ano kailangan mo gawin sa aperture mo? Kailangan mas... Ano gagawin mo kapag gabi sa aperture mo nun?
Malaki.
Mas malaki din yung butas, di ba? So, therefore, makukuhanan mo yung ating image ng mas maliwanag. Kaya nga yung mga cellphone nyo, di ba? Or yung camera nyo sa cellphone nyo, kapag naka-night mode yan, ang tagal. At bawal kang, bawal kang gumalaw. Kasi kapag gumalaw ka, magiging blurred yung image. Sa mga DSLR, meron na siya ng bawal, anti-motion or parang reducing ng ating mga shaky motions. I-click lang nila yon para siyang gimbal na kapag ginalaw mo, hindi siya magiging blurred. Yan. So, how to do naman, kabaligtaran, fast shutter speed photography or kailan natin ginagamit yung mas mabilis na shutter speed. Kasi kanina, ang pinag-uusapan natin, binabagalan natin ang shutter speed. What if naman kapag mas mabilis? So, again, a-adjust mo lang yon sa may mismong shutter speed dial. So, the settings will depend entirely on the light of and the scene. But generally, you'll have to use a wider apertures to capture more light and higher ISO to compensate and take the right exposure. So, kailan the best ginagamit ang fast shutter speed in photography? Kapag?
Daylight.
Another, kapag naman merong actions.
Siguro po pag kunyari gumagalaw na bagay.
Yan. Kapag moving object tayo, katulad ng mga wildlife, kaya yung wildlife photography, kailangan meron silang faster shutter speed. Kasi to freeze. Kasi it freezes an action kapag nag-take kayo ng image using a faster shutter speed. Anong gagawin mo nun? For example, daylight naman. So, you need to capture the moving lion, ganyan. Kailangan mas mabilis or kailangan mong ilagay sa shutter priority or shutter speed priority mode ang iyong shutter button. Tapos, ikaw na mag-adjust ng aperture and ISO mo. Iset mo na siya agad. Okay, iset mo na siya agad. For example, madilim. Therefore, lakihan mo yung iyong aperture kasi madilim-dilim para dumami or madami ang papasok na light sa iyong camera. Tapos, papasok din yung ISO or yung graininess or sometimes the noise, yung parang nagiging blurred. So, kailangan i-adjust mo din siya. So, the shutter speed priority mode is the last way to set the shutter speed on the camera. So, through this semi-automatic camera mode, you set a fixed shutter speed setting and the camera will automatically calculate the aperture. This mode is not very common, but it might be useful when you need to make sure that you're shooting it at a certain shutter speeds. Like for example, when using the shutter speed for shooting from an airplane. Yan. Next slide. So, how to measure? As we move from the left to the right, yung kaninang picture, di ba? left to the right, the shutter speed will be faster. For example, 1/2 indicating half a second and 1/4 or 2,000 fraction of a second. So the distance between one shutter speed at a time and another is what we call the exposure stop. Ito yun eh. Ayan, ito yung pinag-uusapan natin dyan. Diba? Dito sa mga left side, ito yung much slower and sa right side ang much faster. So, ano nga ang tawag dito sa distance na to? For example, 1 second at saka yung 2 seconds. Anong tawag doon? Ang tawag natin ay exposure stop. Yung distance between that. So, understanding how shutter speed is measured is essential before talking about types of shutter speed in photography that you will see now. So, what is a fast shutter speed in photography? Ayan. So, it is essential to know or to consider the terms of fast shutter speed and slow shutter speed to understand the shutter speed effects in photography. So, the fastest shutter speed in photography depends on the camera. But in most of standard digital cameras, it is 4,000 part of a second. So, fast shutter speeds are generally used to reduce time and freeze the moment. Sabi ko nga, kapag moving objects, kailangan mas mabilis ang shutter speed mo. For example, wildlife photography. Yan. The fast shutter speeds are used to capture a bird flying in the sky. So, ganun din. How about the slow photography or shutter speed? So, the slowest shutter speed in the camera is usually 30 seconds. Yung nakaset agad na 30 seconds. Pero, for example, gusto mo ng mas matagal sa 30 seconds, anong gagamitin mo? For example, ang mode or yung parang sa shutter speed dial ng iyong camera, ang pinaka nakalagay lang na pinakamatagal doon is 30 seconds. What if you wanted to have a larger number of seconds? For example, gawin mong 1 minute. Anong gagawin mo? Ano ang isiset mo para makuha mo yung 1 minute na naka-open ang iyong shutter speed or yung mismong shutter? Anong pipindutin yung settings? Hello? Anong pipindutin nating settings? For example, gusto mong 35 seconds. Kasi yung
bulb mode.
Yes, very good. It is the bulb method. Kasi 'di ba, sabi natin sa bulb method, ang bulb method hindi yan magko-close or hindi magko-close ang ating shutter button or yung ating shutter sa loob ng camera unless aalisin mo yung pagkapindot mo sa mismong shutter button. So, kung ang camera mo, ang meron lang siya or the pinaka-maximum is 30 seconds, therefore, gumamit ka na ng bulb method para mas matagal ang kuhanin mo. Yan o, nandyan na nga, diba? You can increase that by using the bulb camera mode or the remote shutter. So, slow shutter speed are used to increase time and capture motion. For example, you can set a slow shutter speed to photograph the movement of the water in the river. So, slow shutter speed photography is also known as a long exposure photography kasi nga matagal. So, for this type of photography, you need a tripod and photography lens filters if you're doing daytime long exposures photography. Kapag mas matagal natin hinahawakan or mas matagal ang shutter speed natin, make sure na meron kayong tripod or yung papatungan. Bakit po? Kasi kapag ikaw, 'di ba? Kapag ikaw ang humahawak, for example, naka-bulb method ka. Ikaw ang pumipindot dun sa mismong camera, anong mangyayari? 30 seconds ba kaya mong hindi gumalaw? Hindi, 'di ba? Sometimes manginginig. Sometimes baka batulak ka or so what. So, anong mangyari nun? Magiging blurred na yung image mo. So, kapag long exposures na tayo sa ating shutter speed, therefore, nangangailangan ka na ng mga tripod, ganyan, or something na papatungan ng camera mo. Applicable lang yung handheld or yung hawak-hawak mo yung camera kapag mas mabilis yung kinetake na picture mo. Yan. The first shutter speed effect on photography is the change in exposure. So, by leaving the camera shutter up or down for a specific period of time, the sensor will capture more or less light which will translate into a brighter or darker exposure. Tignan nyo. Kapag mas slower ang ating shutter speed, anong mangyari? The more na light ang papasok, therefore, anong mangyari sa image? Mas maliwanag. Nakikita nyo ba itong picture? Tingnan mo, more light. Tingnan nyo, mas maliwanag ang picture. Pero kapag mas less light, ibig sabihin, mas faster ang ating shutter speed, mas lalong, dumidilim ang ating image or yung ating exposure. Nagigets nyo ba?
Oh. Opo.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, next. Punta na tayo kay ISO. Ito na. Ano ba ang role? So, okay na tayo kay aperture, okay na tayo kay shutter speed. So, what is ISO naman? So, ISO and the digital noise. Ang ISO, ito na yung katumbas ng, alam niyo yung sa film, naalala niyo yung sensitivity ng film? Yung may DIN, ASA, and ISO. Ito na siya ngayon. So, naging digital lang tayo. So, what is ISO? Let's watch this first.
What is ISO? While shutter speed and aperture control the amount of light physically hitting the sensor, ISO controls the amount of light the camera needs and is a representation of the sensitivity of the image sensor. As the ISO increases, the light it takes to expose the image decreases. For example, doubling the ISO from say 400 to 800 results in the camera needing only half as much light for the same exposure. This is the main reason such high ISO values are used in indoors, especially at sporting events and for photographing wildlife. Needing a fast shutter speed to freeze action and often with limited light available, photographers pump up the ISO as far as they're comfortable doing. However, increasing your ISO doesn't come without drawbacks. Let's compare a camera to a microphone. Microphones gather sound waves from a source, just like cameras gather light rays from the environment, and each turn them into electrical signals, which are outputted as either a sound file for a microphone or an image for a camera. Now, what happens if you're trying to record something very faint, like a whisper? You increase the sensitivity of the microphone. However, besides the whisper being louder, background noise is amplified as well, and you may even hear the hum of the microphone's electronics. Similarly, increasing the ISO of a camera increases its sensitivity to everything, revealing any lighting artifacts, as well as any electrical grain in the system. This phenomenon is referred to as noise in the world of photography. Higher ISO values don't just produce more noise, they also reduce the color accuracy and dynamic range. So you should use the lowest ISO value possible at all times. The lowest ISO value of your camera is considered the base ISO, a term that you may come across in the future. This ISO produces the best image quality and lowest amount of noise, but as stated earlier, low ISO values require lots of ambient light to properly expose the scene. It's also worth mentioning that not all cameras will have the same ISO profile. The ISO performance of your camera largely depends on the size of the photosites in your camera. What is a photosite? When you press the shutter button of your camera, the curtain in front of the image sensor slides up, exposing the photosites to ambient light. The photosites gather photons that enter through the lens, and once the exposure is over, the curtain slides over the sensor and the camera assesses the amount of photons that were gathered, converting the number into an image. Larger sensor cameras allow for larger photosites, which can gather more photons, so full-frame cameras have an advantage over crop sensor cameras. Also, lower megapixel counts mean that each photosite is allowed to take up more space on the sensor, increasing photosite size. However, older, lower megapixel sensors are not better for low-light shooting, as advances in microlens design and the silicon itself have made modern sensors more efficient. So when should we use low and high ISOs? Remember that in every case, you should try to decrease your ISO as much as possible to retain image quality, but sometimes you may be forced to use higher ISOs. Low ISOs are particularly useful in outdoor photography, where the sun will provide lots of light for your camera, allowing you to more freely use faster shutter speeds and smaller apertures. ISO for indoor photography is largely situational. Depending on how well lit the area is, you may want to use higher ISO values. Remember that if your subject is not moving, you can use a slower shutter speed, or if you're okay with a shallower depth of field, use a larger aperture. Night photography. whether it be a moonlit photo shoot or astrophotography, will inevitably require high ISO values. This is where you need to experiment with your camera to find out how far you can push it without serious drawbacks. ISO, while appearing to be a complicated subject, is actually very simple. By exploring your camera's ISO profile and realizing when to use high and low ISOs with an understanding of the principles of image noise and sensitivity, you will be able to directly improve the quality of your photos and be more comfortable with your camera. Stay subscribed to Apple Apps for more animations, which are released
Okay, what is ISO? So ISO, sabi ko nga, ito yung ating sensitivity. If you could remember, in the film cameras, we have the ISO as the combination of ASA and DIN. Ito yung ating sinusukatan natin yung sensitivity of the film. So, in photography, ISO is a very simple tool to increase the brightness of your image in low light conditions or when you need a faster shutter speed. But you need to be careful since using a high ISO or sensitivity in photography will be detrimental to the final quality of your image. Kasi the more na tinataasan natin yung ating ISO, the more na dumadami yung yung graininess niya. Ito yung nakikita niyo na kapag ay blurred yung image or yung parang bakit siya parang may langgam na maliliit. Ito yun. ISO in photography can be explained as a way to increase the light information captured by the camera sensor. So, historically, ISO in photography comes from the acronym International Organization of Standardizations, and a time when the camera manufacturers needed to homogenize the sensitivity ratios in film cameras. So, today, we called it as an ISO. Okay. Naiintindihan po ba niyan? What is the meaning of ISO? We are talking about dito the light sensitivity of the camera. So, how does an ISO in photography works? So, the main effect of ISO in photography is to artificially, increase the light captured by the camera sensor. Kumbaga sa film camera, ito yung film. Okay, or yung sa mga analog camera, ito yung film. Pero dahil digital na nga, ito na yung camera sensor, resulting into a brighter final image. In simple terms, sabi niya, ISO in photography works in the following way. So, the camera sensor collects an amount of light that depends on the aperture of the lens and the time of the sensor exposed or yung shutter speed. So, the light information is also known as the signal in photography. When this light or signal is received, ISO plays a role in making an interpretation of it. This interpretation is related to what we call the amplification of this light. Ito yung nakikita nyo na AMP sa mismong camera. When ISO amplifies the signal or light or the final image will be brighter, it will be progressive, start generating more digital noise as you increase the ISO. Kaya siya nagiging noise kasi parang hindi siya nagiging sharp ang image. So, comprising the final quality of the image. So, how to use? Ayan. How to use camera ISO in photography. So, usually, ginagamit natin, meron tayong tinatawag na base ISO or yung lowest ISO that you have in your camera. That is what we call the best or the base ISO. Ano yung ISO when exposure? Kapag umaga or kapag meron namang enough light, kailangan ang ISO mo mababa. Pero kapag gabi, anong mangyayari? Kailangan, dahil kulang nga ang light mo, anong gagawin mo? Kailangan ang ISO mo mas mataas. Nakikita nyo ba yung picture? Tignan nyo, gabi. Titik nyo yung picture ng gabi. Anong gagawin niya? Para makuha naman ng maliwanag yan or clear, kailangan ang ISO mo mas mataas. So, considering the previous explanation how ISO affects the photography, you'll use the ISO to decide the final settings in your image. ISO should always be used in photography in relation to the aperture and our shutter speed. Kaya nga meron tayong exposure triangle. For example, ayan, considering a fixed aperture value, if you wanted to increase the shutter speed from 2,000 part of a second or double it in 4,000 part of a second, you should increase your ISO one stop to maintain a constant exposure. Naiintindihan nyo na yan. Kapag mas marami ang ilaw, ang ISO mo ay dapat ay
Mas
mas
mababa.
mababa. Okay, mababa. Kapag naman gabi, kailangan or kulang ang light, kailangan mas
Mataas.
mataas. Bakit, ma'am? Kasi nga, 'di ba, sabi natin, ito yung nagsusukat about the sensitivity of the light in the camera. So kapag kanwari maliwanag na, tapos tinaasan mo pa yung ISO mo, anong mangyayari? Parang magiging masusunog na. Or parang magkakaroon ng graininess lalo ang ating image. Okay. So, to capture quality image, 'di ba? The main goal is to set the native ISO or as low as possible. As low as possible kailangan ang ISO. Kaya lang natin tinataasan ng ISO value ng ating camera or ng ating photography kasi minsan madilim. So, as mentioned before, as you start increasing the ISO, you'll progressively pushing the capacity of your camera sensor to create a brighter image. And this will translate into a digital noise. Base ISO is what we call the lowest native ISO level. Yung pinakamababa. Parang sinabi ko lang. So, base ISO is usually ISO 100. ISO values like ISO 200, 400 are considered as low ISO values in photography. Examples, where you should set a low ISO in photography are all scenes with enough light and where you don't need a fast shutter speed. Kung nakita nyo dun sa video, the more na the more na bumibilis ang ating shutter speed, the more na bumababa ang ISO. 'Di ba? Kabaliktarin niya. For example, daylight. Daylight. I'll give you an example. Daylight ngayon, maliwanag. Ano ang gagawin mo sa ISO mo?
Bababaan.
Low or high?
Babaan.
Low. Ano
Low.
gagawin mo sa
Low.
shutter speed mo?
Mas mababa rin, mas mabilis.
Mas mababa o mabilis? Slow or
Mabilis.
fast? Mas
Fast.
mabilis.
Right.
Kasi maliwanag. So, ganun siya. Kaya sabi niya na the more na bumibilis ang iyong shutter speed, the more na bumababa ang ating ISO. Ganun din ba kapag gabi, ma'am? For example, night photography. Ganun din ba siya? Kapag night
Hindi po.
photography, hindi ba siya reverse? Hindi rin ba siya reverse? Are you sure?
Hindi man.
Bakit?
Opo.
Anong gagawin mo sa ISO kapag gabi?
Madilim. Tataasan, ma'am.
Tatasan. Anong gagawin mo sa
Tataasan.
shutter speed mo?
Papagana.
Di
Mas
ba
tataasan
tama?
din yung numbers.
Di baliktad sila? Tama ako. Ibig sabihin,
Ah,
kapag mababa, tignan nyo tignan nyo to, yung sa mismong document na to sa ating PowerPoint. The lower the ISO, the faster the shutter speed. This is applicable when it is daylight, when there is enough light. Pero kapag palitan natin to, gawin nating nighttime to, anong gagawin mo sa ISO? Kailangan ng ISO mo is higher. Tama ba? Diba? Tapos, sa ating shutter speed naman, kailangan mas slower. Can you see the tricky part here? Ito. Examples where you should set a low ISO. Dun sa video kasi, pinakita natin na kapag mas mababa ang ISO, kailangan mas mabilis ang ating shutter speed. Baligtad sila. So, ang tinatanong ko sa inyo, ma'am, applicable din ba yon yung ating kabaligtaran ng ISO at saka shutter speed when it comes to night photography or when there is no enough light? The answer is yes, 'di ba? Sabi natin kapag umaga, kailangan ng ISO is low or high? Low or high?
Low po.
Low. How about in shutter speed? Fast or slow?
Fast.
Fast. Umaga yan. So, kapag umaga, low, fast siya. Tama ko. Diba? Kapag umaga, low at saka fast. Low ISO, fast shutter speed. Tama?
Yes po.
Kapag gabi, Sabi natin, ang pinipilit ni ma'am, pareho din, baligtad din siya. So, anong gagawin mo kapag gabi?
High, slow, ma'am. Parang balik ta rin, ma'am.
Baligtarin mo siya.
High,
Kailangan
slow.
ang high mo is yung ISO. Anong mangyari sa shutter speed nun? Automatically, kailangan mas mabagal or slow. Bakit? Kasi kulang nga ng light, diba? Diba ang usapan natin, kapag kulang ang light, ang shutter speed mo ay kailangan mabagal para pumasok yung madaming light. Nagigets nyo na ba yan?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am yan. Kapag hindi nyo nagawa yung aking activity, ewan ko na lang. So, when to use a high ISO? Sabi niya, however, it's not all rainbows and butterflies and you'll often find challenging light situations where you'll be forced to use a high ISO in photography. High ISO values in photography are mostly used when we have low light conditions or situations where you need at a faster shutter speed. Sabi ko nga sa inyo, 'di ba? Gagamitin mo lang yan or kailangan lang ng ating mas mabilis ang shot or mas matagal ang shutter speed ang ating high ISO. So, using high ISO in night photography is one of the most common situations for using high ISO. Since some scenes like photographing at the Milky Way will require you to push the limits of your camera to capture a dark scene in relatively short exposure of time. So, ito. This is the equivalence exposure wherein pag-uusapan nila yung tatlong pillars of the photography. Do you have any questions so far? Or nalilito kayo niyan? Nalilito ba kayo?
Opo, medyo.
Medyo, okay. Kapag sa mga ganyan, kung nalilito pa kayo, mag-focus muna kayo within the light conditions, maliwanag ba or madilim, and the light and movement, light and motion. So, kapag motion, kailangan ang iniisip nyo is the shutter. Kapag naman, motion yan motion. Kapag naman light conditions, kailangan ang consider nyo dyan is the aperture. And also, papasok na yung ating shutter and ISO. Okay, let's watch this first.
A properly crafted photo is made from 3 ingredients: shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. Together, these 3 camera settings contribute to the overall exposure of an image, as well as its depth of field, level of motion blur, and appearance of grain. In auto mode, your camera will produce an adequately bright image, but it may not suit your creative needs. This is where changing over to manual mode becomes useful. In manual mode, the camera settings are no longer surrendered and you have full control over how your image will look. The only catch is that you will need to know how to maintain a sufficiently bright image, one with no blown highlights and hopefully no clipped shadows, and knowing the values of shutter speed, aperture, and ISO that produce these images will be helpful in adjusting your camera as you seek to fulfill your creative ideas. Let's talk about equivalent exposures. What are equivalent exposures? Well, let's say you want to photograph a flower in the bright sunlight and find that using an aperture of f8, an ISO of 100, and a shutter speed of 1/250th of a second produces a sufficiently bright image, but doesn't have the shallow depth of field effect that you envisioned. If you wanted to use your lens's maximum aperture to create a shallow depth of field, let's say the lens can stop down to a maximum of f2.8, and try to take a photo, it would be extremely overexposed. So how would we use shutter speed and ISO to compensate for the extra light entering the camera? Let's assume that your camera can only go down to ISO 100, so it can't be adjusted to make the image darker. We will need to modify the shutter speed, but by how much? Well, we can look at the number of stops we adjusted the aperture by, and change the shutter speed by the same number. Going from f8 to f2.8 is a 3-stop increase in the amount of light entering the camera, so we need to adjust our shutter speed from 1/250th of a second to 1/2000th of a second. This new exposure of f2.8 with an ISO of 100 and shutter speed of 1/2000th of a second is equivalent to the one before. It's what we call an equivalent exposure. But how do we calculate equivalent exposures? Well, it's relatively simple. If you want to adjust one camera setting, let's say aperture, to make the image brighter, then you need to adjust ISO or shutter speed, whichever one is appropriate, to make the image darker. It's a matter of finding a combination of settings that balance to create an image that is technically perfect based on the creative choices you have made. Just like the example earlier, since the original settings of f8, ISO 100, and 1/250th of a second weren't suiting our creative vision, We adjusted the aperture to produce a shallower depth of field. But because we consequently let more light into the camera, we needed to quicken the shutter speed to decrease the exposure to an adequate level. On screen now are lists of full stop increments for shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. Stop increments for shutter speed. To right, we see an increase in image exposure and a decrease in depth of field as aperture is adjusted, a decrease in motion blur as shutter speed is adjusted, and an increase in grain as ISO is adjusted. For constant lighting conditions, moving in a rightward direction on the chart, increasing the amount of light let into the camera, for either the aperture, shutter speed, or ISO setting, requires a net equal and opposite adjustment in the other direction. To make sense of this, let's do another example, this time with a perfect starting exposure of 1/15 of a second, ISO 800, and f4. Let's say that I wanted to take a portrait, and I wanted minimal motion blur and a shallow depth of field, forcing me to change my shutter speed to 1/125th of a second and my aperture to f2. Through this transformation, I decreased the amount of light entering my camera by 1 stop, since I increased aperture size by 2 stops from f4 to f2, but decreased the amount of light by 3 stops by quickening the shutter speed. If I tried taking a picture now, the shot would be 1 stop underexposed, so we need to raise our ISO from 800 to 1600 to brighten the image. So the equivalent exposure to 1/15th of a second ISO 800 and f4 would in this case be 1/125th of a second f2 and ISO 1600. It's important to note that this is only one situation. If I was shooting a landscape and wanted low noise and high depth of field, forcing me to change my aperture to f8 and my ISO to 100, I would need to compensate the 5-stop reduction in light with the shutter speed, causing me to expose for 2 whole seconds to maintain proper image brightness. Another example would be working with ND filters. ND filters block the amount of light reaching the camera, allowing for the use of long exposures during the daytime, and are rated in stops of light blocking capability. If you are shooting a landscape with the shutter speed of 1/60th of a second, f11 and ISO 100, adding a 10-stop ND filter would let you use an equivalent exposure with a shutter speed of 15 seconds. Since 10 stops of light were removed from the ND filter, we added 10 stops of light with the shutter speed to produce an image with the same brightness, but with a longer shutter speed effect. So, in essence, learning equivalent exposures is really learning about the push-pull nature of camera settings. In the video description, I have included a PDF version of the full stop chart displayed earlier. Not only is this helpful for calculating equivalent exposures, but it also shows how manipulating camera settings changes the effects you see in your photos. Remember to rate the video, leave a comment with your feedback, and let me know if this video helped. Subscribe to and support the channel if desired, and as always, thank you for watching.
So, nakita nyo na ba yun? So, yung nakita nyo sabon parang cheating form. Ito yung, ano ba yung equivalent ng exposure kapag, ay ng ISO kapag ang shutter speed mo ganito, kapag ang aperture mo ganito. So, once nag-move ka ng isa, kunwari, nag-move ka ng aperture, kailangan mag-move din yung isa. Mag-move din naman yung isa. So, ganun ang ating exposure triangle. Depende kasi kung ano yung gusto nyong kuhanin na image. So, for example, just always remember ano ba yung gusto mong kuhanin na image? Gumagalaw ba siya? Sharp ba? Or gusto mo nang magkaroon ng bokeh mode? Or yung parang tinatawag nating blurred sa likod, ganyan. So, kapag we're talking about the depth of field, anong i-adjust mo? That is depth of field, the hyperfocal distance, ganyan. O, kapag pinag-uusapan natin yung depth of field, ano dapat ang ina-adjust mo? Hello? Ano nga ang ina-adjust natin kapag depth of field? What is depth of field ba?
Nearest and farthest.
This is the nearest farthest part of the image that appears to be in a sharp mode. 'Di ba? Ito yung merong blurry effect sa likod. Ganyan, 'di ba? Ito yung depth of field, ito yung naka-focus. Ayan. So kapag ginagawa natin 'yon, anong part ng photography or pillars ng photography ang ina-adjust natin? That is the part of Ha? Anong part yon?
Aperture, ma'am.
Aperture. Di ba kakasabi lang natin yan last week? Pinag-usapan pa lang natin yan last week. Paano natin na-adjust ang depth of field through the use of the aperture. So, ganun yon. Kaya siya ina-adjust na sabi niya push and pull. Bakit po? The more na kung kunwari gusto mo ng bokeh effect, sabi nga nila blurry. Tapos you have enough light naman. Tapos you have the ISO. Para magusto mo yung ganung effect, kailangan i-adjust mo ang ISO. It's either tataasan mo siya or bababaan mo siya or sometimes dahil maliwanag naman, kailangan bababaan mo ang shutter speed mo. Ganyan. So, depende doon sa image na gusto mong i-produce. But if you wanted to have the, for example, normal or what you see is what you get or clearer image that you have, kailangan balance yung tatlo na yan. Kasi kailangan, for example, lalo na sa crime scene photography. Sa crime scene photography kasi hindi naman natin kailangan ng art. Ang kailangan natin is kung ano ang nakikita ng naked eye, kailangan yun ang mapakita natin sa ating images or photos na mapoproduce. So, therefore, kailangan yung ating equivalent exposures or yung ating exposure value ay yung EV, kailangan 0 yan para pantay-pantay sila. So, exposure, it is the amount of light which reaches their camera sensor film. It is a crucial part of how bright or dark your pictures will appear. So, it is the product illumination and time, and there are only two camera settings that affect the actual luminous exposure of an image, the shutter speed and the aperture. So, exposure is computed by the use of light or exposure meter. Para saan yan, ma'am? Kasi papasok na tayo sa tinatawag nating flash photography. So, nakakita na ba kayo ng flash? Ha? Sa cellphone niyo ba may flash? Yes, di ba?
Opo.
So, flash unit, it is a device in photography producing a flash or artificial light to help illuminate a scene. Pag sinabi nating illuminate, liwanagan, di ba? A major purpose of a flash is to illuminate the dark scene. Other uses are capturing quickly moving objects or changing the quality of light. So, most current flash units are electronic, having evolved from single-use flash bulbs and flammable powders. So, the modern cameras are often activate flash units automatically. Yung mga DSLR natin, di ba, built-in na yung kanilang mga flash. But sometimes, nilalagyan pa yan ng another flash. Ano nga ang tawag natin kung sa part ng camera wherein nilalagay natin yung flash?
Hot shoe.
That is the hot shoe. Okay. So, some cameras allow separate flash units. Yun nga kung kailan lalagay mo dun sa hot shoe to be mounted via standardized accessory mount bracket. So, for example, bago pumunta ng flash photography, ay ng filters. For example, di ba, kailangan mong mag-take ng pictures, moving objects. For example, butterfly at night. Di ba ang sabi natin, ano nga ang technique para mag-freeze mo yung moving object?
Yung sa ISO, ma'am.
ISO ba? Para ma-freeze, para mag-stop yung motion. Kapag motion, ano ang inisip natin? Kapag gumagalaw, ano sa tatlo ang pinapriority natin?
Shutter pala, ma'am.
Shutter, 'di ba? Ngayon, what if yung pinipicturean mong moving object na yon gabi? 'Di ba? Gabi. Walang masyadong ilaw. 'Di ba ang sabi natin kapag gabi kailangan ang shutter mo ay alin?
Matagal.
Matagal.
Paano kapag matagal naman naka-open ang shutter mo? Anong mangyari? Magiging blurred ang image mo kapag gumagalaw. Doon papasok ang flash photography. So, for example, you need to capture that moving object at night. 'Di ba? Tapos, alam naman natin na kapag gabi, kulang ang ilaw. So, therefore, kailangan mas matagal ang ating shutter speed. Pero kapag naman matagal ang shutter speed, therefore, hindi natin makukuhanan ng freeze motion itong gumagalaw na object. So, what you will do? You will add the flash. Diba? Gagamitin mo ngayon yung flash para ma-set mo yung ating shutter speed sa mas mabilis at ma-freeze mo yung action. Naiintindihan po ba? Okay? We use flash photography or flash units when we have a darker scene or kulang ang ating ilaw. Nagagets na po ba niyan? Hindi kasama yan sa ating, tawag dito, hindi kasama yan sa tatlong pillars, ha. Ito lang ay just some additional. What if, di ba? Katulad nun, moving object, gabi, anong gagawin mo? Diba? Kailangan mo na ng tulong ng ating flash units. Now, let's go now with the filters. Ayan. So, filters are transparent or translucent glass or gelatin elements that attach to the front of lens, harap. They protect the camera lens, alter the characteristics of light passing through the lens, or add special effects and colors to an image. Katulad nung lagi nilang binabanggit, yung neutral density filters. It is homogeneous medium which absorbs and transmits differentially light rays passing through it. So, filter factor. A color filter will work in such a way that it will transmit its own color and absorbs all the other colors. Katulad ng mga to. Yan. So, by using filters in combination with black and white films, the photographer can control the tonal values to get technically correct rendition or to exaggerate or suppress the tonal differences for visibility. Sa black and white photography kasi, 'di ba, wala naman talagang colors yan. So, ang nagkakaroon lang ng adjustment yan is sa use or tones. Kung gaano ka dark and gaano ka light yung magiging balance ng ating image. So, kailangan gumamit sila ng filter. So, because filter subtract some light passing through the lens, kaya nga, ba't ka maglalagay ng filter sa lens mo? 'Di ba? Para umayos. Para ialisin yung light, ganyan. So, because filter subtract some light passing through the lens, an increase in exposure time or lens opening is necessary. The number of times that the normal exposure must be multiplied is called filter factor. The filter factor depends on the film type and light source in addition to the absorption of the filter. So, sabi dito, the more na naglalagay ka ng filter sa yung lenses, kailangan ina-adjust natin ang ating exposure time or yung shutter speed and the aperture or lens opening. Kailangan i-increase natin siya. Bakit? Kasi dumidilim lalo eh. 'Di ba? Kasi nga ang filter nagre-reduce ng light. So, these are the different filters for photography. But before before this playing this, I just want to end my tawag dito, different types or didiscuss ko muna yung mga different types of filters bago natin to panoorin. So, different uses of filters in photography. Number 1, we have the clear filter. It is also known as the window glass filters or optical flats are completely transparent. Ito filter siya kaso transparent lang or parang salamin lang siya. And ideally perform no filtering of incoming light at all. The only use of a clear filter is to protect the front of the lens para lang hindi magasgas yung front ng lens mo. Kaya mo gagamitin ang clear filter. Kumbaga sa cellphone, ito yung anong tawag mo dun sa cellphone na yon?
Tempered glass.
Tempered glass. Yes, yan. Next, we have the UV filter. This is used to reduce haziness created by the ultraviolet light. Saan ba natin nakukuha tong UV light na to? Sa sun, di ba? The AUV or anti-UV filter is mostly transparent to visible light and can be left of the lens for nearly all shots. UV filters are often used for lens protections much like the clear filters. Another filters in photography are the color correction. Kaya nga merong red filter, blue filter, green filter, yellow filter. Ayan. A major use is to compensate for the effects of lighting not balanced for the film stock rated to color temperature. The use of these filters has been greatly reduced by the widespread adoption of digital photography since color balance problems are now often addressed with software after the image is captured or with the camera settings as the image is captured. So, kadalasan kasi ginagamit itong mga color correction filters na to, yung mga yellow, ganyan, sa film. Pero dahil nga digital na ngayon, 'di ba, meron ng settings na pwede mong i-edit yung color ng ating image. So, we have color inversion filters and color compensating filters. Ito yan, no. So these are with reference number, which is yellowish or orange, for lowering the color temperature of the light. Filters with even numbers are bluish and raise the color temperature. These set filters change a particular light source by an amount required for a particular film type. So yung mga color conversion filters are sometimes yellowish or orange, or sometimes naman, sabi nga nila, bluish. And the other one types of color filters is the color compensating filters naman. These are the best through gelatines, various tints and trends. These allow you to fine-tune adjustments towards warmer or colder image results. We also have the color subtraction filters. These work by absorbing certain colors of light, letting the remaining colors through. They can be used to demonstrate a primary colors that make up an image. So they are perhaps most frequently used in printing industry or color separations. We also have the contrast enhancement. Diba kapag nag-edit kayo, kapag nagko-contrast ka, kapag high contrast, the more na nagiging dark yung image mo. Filters are commonly used in black and white to photography to manipulate the contrast or yung darkness nga. For example, a yellow filter will enhance the contrast between clouds and sky by darkening the latter. Yun ang ating contrast enhancement. So, types of color filters. We have blue filters. Ito. So, isa-isay natin. Blue filters, this can be used effectively when photographing blood in a black and white. So, for example, ayan na. Diba sinabi ko nga sa inyo, yung color filters, kadalasan ginagamit nila yan noong black and white photography pa or analog camera pa. So, dati, kapag gumagamit sila ng blood, so para ma-distinguish nila na blood nga yung ating liquid na yun sa photo, gagamit sila ng blue filter. When used outdoors, it will make the sky and the blue objects appear white in the photograph. Next naman, green filters. Used in place of blue filter, photographing blood, often they work better than the blue filter. So, na-discover nila na mas maganda pang gamitin ng green filter than the blue filters. Yellow filters naman, it can be used to photograph white cars. Ayan. The details of the car will stand out para makita natin. Yellow filters also cut through the haze to a certain extent and can be used with a good result to photograph an accident or a hazy day. We also have the ultraviolet filter. It is not a filter for ultraviolet photography, but it's a filter to screen out the violet of the spectrum. So when placed in the front of lens, it will not only improve most of the police photographer's work, but it will also prevent his lens from being scratched. Yung ultraviolet filter dito is parang katulad lang ng clear filter. We also have the special 18A or deep purple filter. It is the correct filter for ultraviolet photography. These are often used in photography with short wavelength, give a better definition of fine details. For example, gumamit sila ng UV light, diba? Naghahanap sila ng evidences, for example, the semen. Ginagamit nila itong special 18A deep purple filter para mas maging detailed yung kukuhanin nilang images. And the last one for the color filters, we have the polarizing filter. It is used to cut down the light transmission. They do not otherwise affect the color or tonal quality of the scene. It just only polarizes the filter from the light. So, ang polarizing filter na to, nire-reduce lang niya yung mismong light para mas hindi siya ganun sunog. And the types of filter in black and white photography, or the general types of filters, we have the correction filters, contrast filters, the haze filters. Ayan, ito yung sa may correction ng kapag may reflection. And we also have this one. Ito laging ginagamit nila, neutral density filters, used for reducing the amount of light transmitted without changing the color value. And the last one, we have the polarizing filter, used to reduce or eliminate reflections on highly reflective surfaces. So for that, let's watch this one para mas lalo nyong maintindihan kung ano yung filters for photography.
Hello and welcome to GMAX Studios. Today we are going to talk about the different kinds of filters that you can use to improve your photography. So traditionally, when people shot on film, there were a lot of filters that were used, like this red filter or this yellow filter, to achieve the kind of effect that you wanted in camera, because post-processing and adding effects on film was pretty difficult. With the advent of digital and software like Adobe Lightroom and Adobe Photoshop, all this has become very easy, and the use of filters has possibly reduced to an extent that only two kinds of filters are used today. So one of these filters is the polarizing filter, the effect of which cannot be easily replicated in software like Photoshop or Lightroom. What the polarizing filter basically does is cut the glare or reflection coming into the camera, thereby making your picture clearer. So these are some photographs under the glass top of my table, and you can see that there is a pretty strong reflection on them. Now, as we put the polarizing filter and as we turn the ring, you can see the reflection slowly decreasing almost to the point where it is non-existent. The same thing from another angle. A lot of people use it to shoot landscapes to cut out the atmospheric glare or glare coming from water bodies. But a lot of people use them for portraits as well. Though the use of polarizers is not really popular while taking portraits, but you can see that with the use of a polarizer, how the highlights on the hair get cut out and how the highlights on the leaves behind the subject also get cut out, almost as if somebody has put a diffuser. Let's see this again. This is with a polarizing filter and this without. The other filter is the ND or the neutral density filter, the effect of which cannot be replicated easily in any post-processing software. The ND filter is a piece of darkened glass that you put in front of your lens, thereby reducing the amount of light that enters into the camera. This increases your control over the aperture and the shutter speed, especially in broad daylight. A lot of people use ND filters to cut down the light so much that they can use long exposures during daylight to get photographs like these. ND filters are available in varying strengths, and you can choose and pick whether you want a darker ND filter or a lighter one according to your specific needs. But there is one filter which is called the variable ND filter, which is just a single filter and it changes its density or darkness as you turn the ring. So if you turn the ring in one direction, it becomes dark, and if you turn it in the other direction, it becomes light. Though ND filters are not used indoors, but we are going to do this anyway, just for demonstration. Now the earlier properly exposed photograph looks underexposed after putting the ND filter, and we have to open the aperture to bring back the correct value. As we turn the filter more, it gets darker and darker. Usually variable ND filters cut down anything from 6 stops to 10 stops of light. So these are the two filters that you would use primarily today while shooting digital. For the rest, as they say, there is always Photoshop. Share this video with your friends and subscribe to our channel. Until the next video, bye-bye.
So So that is the filters in photography. Now, I'm going to discuss to you your different activities for lab activity number 12 and lab activity number 13. So, lab activity number 12. So, camera exposures. Dalawa lang naman. Intindihin nyo lang muna mismo kung ano ba yung gagawin nyo. Stop motion of an electric fan. So, dito lalagay nyo yung F number.
Ma'am, nakamute ka, ma'am.
Okay. So, lab activity number 12. Dito lalagay nyo stop motion of an electric fan. Ito na yung activities nyo. Activity number 12. So, stop motion of an electric fan. Ito yung paandrin nyo po yung electric fan. Tapos, kailangan makuhanan nyo na habang umiikot yung electric fan, makuhanan nyo yung stop motion niya na parang naka-freeze yung ating fan ng ating electric fan. So, paano nyo gagawin yon? So, sabi ko nga, paglaruan nyo yung pro cam nyo. Kung wala kayong settings na ganyan na pro sa inyong camera, you can download yung Procam X Lite, pwede rin naman, para ma-edit nyo yung settings ng shutter speed, the aperture, and the ISO. Okay? So, i-indicate nyo kasi doon. So, ano yung F number na nilagay mo, shutter speed na nilagay mo, and ISO. Paano ko ma-assure na ikaw nga ang nag-take ng pictures noon or nag-edit ng settings na yan? Kailangan, katulad ng ginawa nyo sa last activity nyo, naka-screen record po ang pag-take nyo ng photo. So, number 1 na ipoproduce nyo dito is the stop motion of electric fan or the freeze action of the fan. Saan lalagay yung pictures? Dito po. Then, we also have another one naman, object at nighttime without the use of flash. So, for example, idalhin mo maglagay ka ng bola or kung ano mang object, tapos yun ang magiging parang subject mo sa iyong image. So, paano mo mapapakita yung bola sa image kung alam mong gabi? So, yun ang pinag-uusapan natin dito.
Ma'am?
Yes, ano yun?
Gumagalaw din po yan?
Hindi.
Yung object?
Yung gumagalaw lang natin is ito. Kaya nga sabi ko, without the use of flash. Kasi kapag gumagalaw yan, kailangan gumamit ka na ng flash. So, kapag gumagalaw, ito lang stop motion ng electric fan. So, kapag naman gabi, kahit pwede ngang buwan diba? Or, kapag buwan kasi, hindi natin masabi yung gabi ngayon kung madilim ba or maliwanag. So, that is why gusto ko object lang. Ang gusto ko lang, walang masyadong kasi gabi, di ba? Gusto ko walang masyadong ilaw para makita natin na kapag pala in-adjust ko to or kapag in-adjust ko yung aperture ko, in-adjust ko yung shutter speed ko, makukuhanan ko pa rin yung aking letrato ng maliwanag. Nagkakaintindihan tayo? This is the application of what we have learned kanina. Okay po? May tanong kayo?
Ma'am.
Yes,
Okay po, ma'am.
Meron po.
Ano yun, Nak?
May ano pong app, meron po ba kayo mga app na
Yes,
pwede?
Camera Pro. Camera Pro. Or, tawag dito? Procam
Ano po ba
X.
yung Pro X, ma'am?
Ha?
Yung Pro X. Ma'am, walang focal number dun, ma'am, sa Procam X Lite.
Try nyo yung isa, manual camera light. Ito. Manual camera light, meron siya.
Yung DSLR po.
DSLR pwede kung meron. Mas maganda. Kung meron kayo, ha? Kaso, kailangan mong i-document. Nagpapabideo ka niyan sa iba. Kung may DSLR kayo, sige, okay lang. Much better. Kung meron din naman yung mismong cellphone nyo na app na, for example, yung sa akin kasi sa phone ko, meron siyang Pro agad So, pwede ko na siyang i-edit. Ngayon, kung wala kayo, pwede kayo mag-download ng apps. Pwede yung Procam X Lite. Or pwede rin naman yung ating yung isa, yung manual
Yung manual
camera.
po.
Okay? Nagkakaintindihan tayo? Saan lalagay? Dito, yung F number, shutter speed, and ISO. So, paano ko malalaman na ikaw nga ang nagtitig ng photo? Kailangan naka-screen record po yan. Kung DSLR yan, dapat nagpapa-video ka. Okay, next activity naman is punta tayo kay lab activity number 3. I love activity number 13. Hindi pa pala nalis yung copy ng Word. So, dito madali lang naman, the types of filters na discuss doon. Lagay niya lang doon, for example, ND filters, different uses. Siguro dito, nakalimutan ko lang nilagay kung ilan, pero 5 filters will do. So, you're just going to type here, for example, ND filters, describe kung ano ginagawa ng neutral density filters, and then you can search just photos and internet wherein parang tawag dito, this is a sample photo using the neutral density filters. Parang gawan nyo ng comparison. For example, dito sa left side, wala siyang filter. Sa right side, meron siyang filter. So, ganun lang ang i-search nyo. I-search nyo lang yung photo, hindi nyo kailangan i-produce. Okay po? Meron pa bang ano dito, ma'am? Meron pa bang screen record? Wala, since this is researchable. Do you have any questions so far? Mahirap po ba?
Wala na po, ma'am. Thank you po.
Gustong-gusto mo nang umalis, ano? So, if wala na kayong questions, I will just stop this recording.